Hello everyone, this is Professor Kuehn. I'm recording this video from my office at Wisconsin Lutheran College. This lecture is prepared for students who are taking my course Physics 151 or Physics 201 at the college. This course is titled Space, Time, and Motion. As I mentioned my syllabus for this course, the course is really divided into 4 separate units. The first unit, we'll be studying the works of Galileo. We'll be focusing on a book called Dialogues Concerning Two New Sciences. I'm just going to run through this briefly. The second unit is going to be on the work of Blaise Pascal, specifically his physical treatises where he talks about the weight of fluids and atmospheric pressure. The third unit is going to focus on the work of Isaac Newton, specifically his Principia, or Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. That's the longer title, but Principia for short. And the final unit of the course is going to be on the work of Albert Einstein, specifically his special theory of relativity. So the present lecture is going to provide a short introduction to the work of Galileo. So let's get right into it. So Galileo, this is some biographical background information about Galileo. He was born in 1564. He was a scientist and an engineer and really a philosopher who was born in Pisa in Italy. He's one of 6 children. His father was a fairly famous lutist and music theorist, and you'll see that coming through in some of his dialogues. He has a very strong interest in music and its relationship to mathematics and science. Galileo considered becoming a priest, but then he decided to study medicine at the University of Pisa. This was primarily, apparently, for financial reasons. But after attending some geometry lectures, he decided to transfer to mathematics and natural philosophy. So natural philosophy is, I guess, what we would now call science, but it was more broadly understood about the philosophy of nature. How do we understand nature? The first public lecture that Galileo gave was in 1588. This was an interesting lecture titled On the Shape, Location, and Size of Dante's Inferno. Now, some of you may have come across Dante's Inferno. I don't know if you've read this before, but it was a long poem written by Dante, of course, and it was a very famous piece of literature. And it was very well known to the Italians, of course, and to many other people. And so what Galileo basically did in this first job talk of his is he was kind of demonstrating that he understood literature, and he also understood how to do mathematical and scientific analysis. So strictly speaking, what he did in this lecture is he tried to do a structural analysis of Dante's Inferno, or Hell, basically reported the dimensions of it, the size, the columns, and so on that Dante wrote about, and tried to argue that it was structurally sound. So it was a nice way of marrying a study of literature and science. And he must have done a good job because he was appointed as an instructor of perspective and chiaroscuro, that's kind of the study of light and dark in art, at the Academy of Art and Design in Florence. Later on, Galileo went on to teach geometry and mathematics and astronomy at the University of Padua until 1610. So in 1632, let me jump ahead a little bit. This is a very brief overview of Galileo. He published a book called his Dialogues Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, Copernican and Ptolemaic. So let me say a few things about that. So remember, at the time of Galileo, Copernicus had just published his Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. So Copernicus published this in 1543. It was a book in which he argued that the Earth revolved around the sun. And this was a revolutionary idea at the time, because the older perspective was one of geocentrism, that is, that the Earth is at the center of the universe and the sun and the other planets go around the Earth. That would be the Ptolemaic system, or the ancient. It was actually a system that dates back much further to the time of Aristotle and before, the ancient Greeks, and it was popular up through the Middle Ages. Ptolemy was a very famous ancient Greek astronomer whose work on the geocentric worldview basically shaped thinking all the way up through the Middle Ages. Copernicus then in 1543 wrote this book where he was challenging this and saying that actually the Earth goes around the sun. It's interesting because Copernicus in this work, he tried to present himself as reviving an ancient idea that had been dismissed too soon. In fact, there were ancient Greek thinkers who thought that the Earth was one of the planets, so Copernicus said, we basically rejected this idea too soon, let's go back to this idea. Anyhow, Copernicus wrote this book, published it, and he had dedicated it to Pope Paul III. This is during the time of the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V. In 1543 is when Copernicus published this. And having dedicated to the Pope, it actually didn't cause that much controversy, in the sense because he was very deferential and he was presenting this as an idea that should be considered. And in fact, it went over quite well at the time. But by the time Galileo was defending the Copernican worldview, things had changed a bit. This was at the time of the Protestant Reformation, and I think what was happening is you see some kind of reactionary attempts to kind of push down ideas that were not officially sanctioned. And so in 1616, there was an inquisitorial council that branded Copernicus's view of heliocentrism as, quote, foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical. since it expressly contradicts the sense of sacred scripture in many places. So between 1543, when he published it, and 1616, there's sort of a change of view that the church was trying to clamp down a little bit and saying this not only doesn't philosophically make sense, but it formally looks heretical, like it contradicts scripture. So this is a topic we spend a lot more time talking about in my Physics 101 astronomy course, but I'm just giving you a brief overview here. So then in 1632, Galileo comes along and publishes his dialogues concerning the two chief world systems, Copernican and Ptolemaic, and in this he argued that the Ptolemaic or geocentric system was incorrect and the Copernican or heliocentric system was in fact the correct model. There were a number of Jesuit theologians, specifically Bellarmine, who argued that the literal sense of scripture has to be maintained as long as it doesn't conflict with any other philosophical or astronomical truths. So there was some resistance to Galileo's ideas, and as a result, Galileo was subsequently charged with vehement suspicion of heresy. He wasn't actually charged with heresy, he was charged with suspicion of heresy, and he was sentenced to house arrest for several years after that. So in 1638, during the time of his house arrest, Galileo published his final work, which was called his Dialogue Concerning Two New Sciences. So don't be confused. He wrote two books that are called the Dialogues. One is a dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. That was primarily an astronomy book, comparing the work of Copernicus to the work of Ptolemy. This is his Dialogues Concerning Two New Sciences. This is his last work, kind of the summation of his life, published in 1638. This is the text that we'll be focusing on in this class. So I'm going to spend a few minutes giving an overview of his Dialogues Concerning Two New Sciences. And by the way, I'll probably just call this his Dialogues because it's tiring to keep saying Dialogues Concerning Two New Sciences. So it's called a dialogue because it is formed, it's written as a friendly conversation, kind of like reading a play. It's written as a conversation taking place over the course of 4 days. So when you read this, you'll see that it says, for example, day 1, and then there are 3 people who are talking. And then they'll go on to day 2, and those 3 people are having a conversation once again, day 3 and day 4. So that's the way that the dialogues are broken apart into 4 days of conversation. The conversation is taking place between 3 people. Their names are Salviati, Segreto, and Simplicio. Of course, they're all S names, so it's hard to keep them straight, but you have to try to do that, okay? So Salviati is the one who is really representing the ideas of Galileo. So sometimes Salviati will say, I was reading a book by this famous scientist, and he says this. And the idea is that Salviati is reporting what Galileo himself was writing down. So Salviati is the mouthpiece for Galileo's ideas. And then Segreto and Simplicio will then ask him questions. So for example, they'll say, I don't believe what you're saying about how cannonballs fall. So can you explain this in more detail? And I've been taught something differently, so how do you explain your ideas? So Segreto and Simplicio are interrogating Salviati and trying to grow and understand what Salviati is talking about. Segreto is really sort of the presented as the honest learner, someone who really wants to understand. Sometimes Simplicio, as his name might imply, is someone who's parroting the old ideas that Galileo is trying to combat. So Simplicio is basically serving as a mouthpiece for older, they might say older or Aristotelian thinking. And Simplicio is saying, well, Aristotle taught this, and that's what I believe. And then Salviati will come back and say, yeah, well, Aristotle was incorrect. Aristotle was correct about some things, but he was incorrect about other things. So you'll notice that this really takes place in the form of a play or a dialogue. It's interesting to point out that this is a very uncommon thing to do today. I don't pick up a copy of Physical Review Letters and read an article and it's written in the form of a dialogue, right? It's not a common thing to see this now, but it's actually a quite refreshing thing to come across because it gives it a rhetorical style that's very entertaining to read. And you'll notice that Galileo has a lot of humor in this as well. Some of it's very subtle humor and satirical, and some of it is really obvious. But it allows him to this dialogue form allows him to meet some of the objections that he was anticipating when presenting some of his ideas. So that's why it's called the Dialogues Concerning Two New Sciences. So why is it called the Dialogue Concerning Two New Sciences? So, well, because there are 2 primary topics that he's talking about, these 2 new sciences. And so what are these sciences or topics of study that he's going to be talking about? Well, the first one is the strength of materials. So he's interested in the topic of how hard it is to break things and why are they difficult to break. Does it have to do with their size, their shape, the material out of which they're composed, or what are the factors that give rise to the strength of materials? So that is the first new science that Galileo is discussing. The second new science that he's discussing will be the science of falling objects, falling bodies, and projectiles. So Galileo is very interested in practical questions of how far can you shoot a cannonball, the idea of artillery. So he wants to get a better understanding of the science of projectile motion or artillery. Now, although these are the 2 new sciences, the 2 main topics that Galileo is discussing, you're going to find that the conversation of these 3 people turns to many, many subjects. So it gives an opportunity for Galileo to discuss his ideas about many scientific and mathematical, in fact, philosophical and even theological ideas. And I have a quote here where they're having this dialogue back and forth, and one of them says, if by digression, that is kind of going off on these tangents, if by digression we can reach new truth, what harm is there in making one now? So that's sort of the philosophy. If in the context of talking about the strength of materials, we have to talk a little bit about the principle of the lever or how things balance, then that's a great thing because we can grow in wisdom by talking about these digressions. But they always kind of come back to these two new sciences, these two main topics after going across into these digressions. This quote goes on to say, remember that we are not tied down to a fixed and brief method, but we meet solely for our own entertainment. So this is a nice, refreshing approach that we're not in this because we have to follow a particular method. Rather, we're trying to enjoy what we're doing. We're having a scientific conversation about science, and this is for our enjoyment. So that's something that he mentions. So what are some of these digressions, some of these other topics that Galileo discusses in his 1638 book? Well, I'm just going to tick off some of these that we're going to come across, and we'll be covering these during the first 5 or 6 weeks of this course. So some of the topics is, how do the physical properties of a structure, particularly its resistance to fracture, scale with its size? So for example, if I have a boat, let's say I'm building a boat and it has a mast, and then it has a crossbeam from which you hang a sail, and the crossbeam is able to support a sail. Let's suppose now that you were wanting to make that boat twice as big. So you wanted to make the boat twice as long, twice as wide, twice as tall, the mast twice as tall and twice as thick. You were to scale everything up by a factor of 2. Would that beam, that cross beam, still be able to support the sail? And for that matter, would it still be able to support itself? Or is there some scale, some size that things would break under their own weight? So, and if so, would this put a limit on the size of built structures? So is there a size that you would make things beyond which they would actually collapse under their own weight? Does it give a limit to the size of built structures or art, human arts, or even to the size of viable living organisms? So for example, if you were to have a human being hold out his or her arm, you have to support the weight of your arm in so doing. And if you were to have a giant, let's say, a person twice as big with their arm twice as long and twice as thick, would that giant's arm be able to, would the giant still be able to support his arm? Okay, and not only human beings, but other kinds of organisms. So can you just scale up the size of organisms and their bodies would work just as well? This is a topic that Galileo is very interested in, and it actually inspires many later thinkers who are discussing metabolic rates and other kinds of processes in biological organisms. And we'll actually touch on this a little bit more in the context of Galileo's work. Another topic that Galileo is interested in is what is it that holds materials together? So if you have a rope and you're trying to break a rope, a piece of hemp rope, what is it that actually binds the fibers together? Is there like, there's not glue in it, so how do they stick together so that the rope doesn't break? After all, a rope, as he mentions, if you have a 100-foot rope, there are not a bundle of 100-foot threads. They're actually short threads woven together. And when you try to break it, it's very difficult to break. So what is it that holds a rope together? And for that matter, what is it that holds concrete or marble or gold or water together? So what is the kind of, what is the process by which things hold together? He throws out some ideas, and you're going to see that this is approaching the topic of atomism. So how is this topic of the cohesion of materials related to their microscopic structure? This is a topic that Galileo is very interested in. In this topic, he also is interested in the question of, does nature permit a vacuum? So the idea at the time that was very popular is that nature abhors a vacuum. You've probably heard this term before. Nature abhors a vacuum. It's usually referred to talk about political situations. When one ruler is deposed, one will fill his place because nature doesn't like a vacuum, right? But this topic, this idea in a physical sense, is that nature doesn't actually permit a vacuum. So if you try to, if you take 2 microscope slides, 2 glass plates, and try to pull them apart, it's hard to get them apart. And it's not because there's some glue between them. The scientists at the time would say, well, it's because in so doing you would have to create a vacuum between them, and because nature abhors or hates a vacuum, that's what causes those microscope slides to stick together. So does nature, Galileo is interested in, does nature in fact permit a vacuum, and how is nature's abhorrence of a vacuum, how can it account for the cohesion or sticking together of materials?